Alright, so in the previous video we talked about how one of the key principles of mercantilism was this idea that international trade was a zero-sum game. That is, that there had to be a winner and loser in any instance of international trade. Perhaps not surprisingly, since it became a prominent movement, there are a number of academics and economists who pointed out that this idea of a zero-sum game in international trade perhaps didn't always have to be the case, and instead they argued, some of these people argued that you could have a win-win outcome in international trade. And one such advocate of this idea was a guy called Adam Smith, and you can see a photo of Adam down there in a very clearly not photoshopped image in his St Kilda gear, and he wrote his thoughts down in a famous publication called The Wealth of Nations, which was in 1776, and he argued against this idea of trade as a zero-sum game. Instead, he argued that a country has, as he termed it, an absolute advantage in the production of a good when it is more efficient than any other country in producing that particular good. As a consequence, he then argued that countries should choose to specialise in the production of goods for which they have an absolute advantage, that is, that they are most efficient at relative to other nations, and then trade for these goods for the goods produced by other countries, which are produced by more efficiently by those other countries. So Smith argued that countries differ in their ability to produce goods efficiently due to a number of different factors. And the first group were the level of natural endowments located in a particular country, and that includes things like land, resources, and the climate. But also, he argued, due to country-specific abilities and expertise. So going back to our first video from this week, Japan, of course, has developed expertise in the manufacturing of cars. India has developed significant expertise and specialties in software development. So given this, Smith argued that the government's role was to support industries where an absolute advantage exists. That is, that they should subsidise the local producers that manufacture items and goods that the country is able to produce more efficiently than other countries. He also said that countries should only produce goods where it is most efficient, and therefore trade those goods for those goods where it is not the most efficient. Now, when we talk about efficiency, to Smith, this meant the ability of a country to produce more of a product from the same input than other countries. Now, while most people could see the validity of many of the arguments put forward by Smith through absolute advantage, there were some people who questioned some of the principles and the ideas behind his theory. One such person was a guy called David Ricardo, and you can see a photo of him up in the top right of your screen there. There he is, having a great time in his St Kilda gear with Nick Revolt. And he published a book in 1817 called The Principles of Political Economy and Taxation, and he explored a hypothetical scenario where one country has an absolute advantage in the production of all goods. Now, of course, according to the theory of absolute advantage as proposed by Adam Smith, in that scenario, the country that has the absolute advantage in the production of all those goods should produce all of those goods and then trade for the others. Now, obviously, you can see there's a problem here, because if the other countries do not produce any goods more efficiently than that single country, then they're not going to be able to trade for it in the first place. And even just the idea that a country can have an absolute advantage in all goods is not particularly feasible. So he said that there are some underlying problems with Smith's proposed notion of absolute advantage. So instead, he proposed a different extension of that model that he termed comparative advantage, and he argued that countries should instead specialise in the production of those goods they produced most efficiently and buy goods that they produced less efficiently from other countries. Now, while this might sound roughly the same as what Smith was arguing in absolute advantage in his earlier theory, the key difference here is that Ricardo said a country should identify the small group, say maybe 2, 3 or 4 industries that it does most efficiently, even if it does all of the industries more efficiently than other countries and focus on those, and then buy goods that they produce less efficiently, that is everything outside of those 2, 3 or 4 industries, from other countries. And that this might mean even that there's a situation where the country is buying goods from another country that they could actually produce more efficiently at home themselves. But the key focus here, according to Ricardo, was this specialisation and this productivity related benefits from identifying and focusing on just a small number of industries that a country could do best. So Ricardo extended the free trade argument that was originally postulated by Smith and believed that the efficiency of resource utilisation was the key here, and that was what led to higher levels of productivity. And the whole notion of productivity was what underpinned the theory of comparative advantage in the first place. He did agree with Smith that trade is a positive sum game, but did argue that comparative advantage arises from differences in productivity. And as I say, this is the key here. He said that instead of just producing everything that you can produce better than another country, try and identify the small selection of things that you as a country do best, and then let other countries specialise in everything else. And that will ultimately lead to the most productive outcome in terms of economic growth and beneficial trade. In terms of the role of government, Ricardo said that governments, not surprisingly, should use public policy to support industries where a comparative advantage exists. That is, those small selection of industries that have been identified as the things that the country can do most efficiently. Just to summarise this video, it is worthwhile posing the question of, is unrestricted free trade, as championed by both absolute and comparative advantage theories, always beneficial? And as I say, certainly people like Adam Smith and David Ricardo would suggest it absolutely is. Research, though, has not been so overwhelming in support of that. It has identified that absolutely we can see some benefits from international trade, but the gains won't always be as great as relatively simple models of comparative advantage would initially suggest. And this is due to a number of different factors. Some of the primary ones we've listed here and include things like the immobility of resources. According to Ricardo and his model of comparative advantage, a country should effectively shift all of its focus and resources towards that selection of industries that they have a comparative advantage in, that is, that they are most efficient in. Of course, this in theory means if a country identified, for example, an IT proficiency as its specialty and its focus, then a farmer and everybody else who was not in IT would have to quit their jobs and become IT specialists. As you can imagine just from listening to that, that's easier said than done, and in some cases it's not possible at all. Some people literally just will not have the necessary skills and resources available to move into a different industry altogether. So that's one flaw with the idea of comparative advantage. There's also the issue of diminishing returns. So Ricardo argued that a government and its people should devote all of its available resources towards those industries where they have a comparative advantage, in an effort to try and improve their efficiency and become more productive in that particular industry. That's all well and good, but what we have found is that once you start to get good at something and start to become more efficient at it, to continue to improve your efficiency levels there, you start having to devote more and more resources, and rather than having a constant rate of growth and improvement, you end up with this idea of diminishing returns, where you have to devote more and more resources just to get relatively incremental improvements in your efficiency. So it's not always that simple in that sense either. There's also the issue of dynamic effects and economic growth. So opening a country up to trade means that you might increase a country's stock of resources as increased supplies become available from overseas, and that the efficiency of resource utilisation would also free up additional resources for other economic uses. This contrasts with the relatively simple application of comparative advantage, which assumed that there was a limited amount of resources which could be devoted towards any particular activity, when, as we have demonstrated here, that simply is not always the case. Finally, there have been some research which have actually questioned whether it's always in the best idea for a country to engage in international trade in the first place, whether it does actually guarantee economic growth. And there are a number of different examples that you could cite here, some of which are touched on in the readings for this week. So do have a look at those. But the key takeaway here is that absolutely these models and theories are very useful in explaining and highlighting the importance of international trade, but it's not always perhaps as simple or indeed as beneficial as these theories have actually suggested.